Good afternoon. I welcome you all to the next plenary session. I hope you're going to enjoy the whole session. The session is titled From Ethics to Action, Civil Society Strategies for Shaping the Development and Deployment of Artificial Intelligence. That's the topic that we're going to be speaking about. But before we start, I want to start with a fundamental question to all of you, not to the panelists. Before I introduce the panelists, we're going to be starting with one fundamental question. What did Mr. Punacha say in the previous session about 4 A's that are very important? And what was the first A? What was the first A? No, come on. What was the first A? He mentioned about there are 4 A's, and he said the first A is what? Attention. So I request your kind attention. Let's follow Punacha's guidance so that we start with attention. After lunch, attention is difficult, but let's start with that. Yeah? Okay. We have a fantastic panel. I'm so blessed with so many thoughtful inputs over the past 2 days, and I'm glad that we are there as part of this panel, right? You know each of them, but I'm going to reflect it more from a perspective of each specialization, what they're going to bring to the table from how I see it, right? So let's start from the end, right? Now, Dr. Gopalakrishnan is going to bring in the perspective of education and multi-stakeholder input in dealing with artificial intelligence in the context of ethics to action, right? Alison is going to bring in the perspective of dealing with open source, dealing with diversity, dealing with bias in the context of artificial intelligence and how it is necessary in the space that we are in. Noel is going to bring in the policy perspective and regulatory nuance that is necessary to deal with a complex topic like ethics, right? And Oded is going to reflect on how you can balance your approach in building artificial intelligence in a way that you can align ethics with it, with more awareness and preparedness for the users. And Dr. Avinash is going to bring in the perspective of how standards are going to play a critical role, how benchmarking is critical when looking at AI systems. And Vilas is going to bring a perspective of how open innovation and looking at tech for good is important milestone for us to progress towards, right? I introduced them in a very different way, but that's to set a context on the topic that we're going to be speaking about. I want to give a 1-minute prelude on this topic itself. I'm from Tamil Nadu. I live currently in Bangalore. In Tamil, there is an old literature called Tirukkural. Many of you will be familiar with it. I was affected by COVID, and I was isolated. I was jobless. I thought, let me try and explore something. I tried to understand what ethics means in Tirukkural. And I'm going to tell you what I learned from there. Ethics in Tirukkural is referred to as Araneri. Araneri, right? It's Neri Muregal, and it has multiple forms of it. Neri Muregal is primarily about norms, right? Approach to building norms. The way ethics is perceived in a 2,000-year-old text is approach to clarifying or drafting norms. That's what it means. And they are looking at it in 4 different forms. They're looking at it from the form of legal ethics, moral ethics, behavioral ethics, and tradition ethics. They wanted to ensure the traditional principles are carried out, which is the sense of human values are carried out, right? As we speak now, we are in the inflection point of trying to understand how all these can come together. We're currently looking at it as legal ethics or sometimes morality, and there is a lot of confusion in this particular space. As civil society organizations, how do we need to deal with this particular inflection point is going to be the subject of the conversation. With that, I want to start off with this first question of ethics to practice. Why is it critical now? Vilas, let's start with you.
Thank you. I have to correct you on one thing. You asked for the 4 A's. You asked for the wrong one. If I remember correctly, the second A was appreciation. Forget about attention. We should be asking for appreciation. And appreciation for your moderation and the importance of this topic. Look, I'll keep it very short. This is not really a question about ethics. It's a question about something much more fundamental. Are we acting in ways that let us look at ourselves and feel dignity and respect, that we made choices that centered compassion and kindness? It's always been important, but it's really important now because we're making choices that will define the future history for decades and even centuries. So we should feel the weight of that responsibility. Like, now is the time where we have to develop these tools and interventions.
I just want to connect this thought to you, Noel, right? You've worked in this space of policy and building policies relating to AI. One of the things that I wanted to ask you, Noel, is that from the perspective of what Vilas says, what is that you think is critical given the regulatory gamut at this point in time?
Thank you, Sundar. So I think that what I'm going to say now is new. I wouldn't have been able to say it, last year. But I think the pressing issue in my view right now is this concept of regulatory divergence. A couple years ago, right, we're talking about ethics, and everyone pretty much aligned on ethics, and that the world aligned. Everyone agreed, fairness, yes, transparency, yes, robustness, yes, all these things are great. Yes, there were challenges in implementation, but the world agreed with the ethical principles that were underlying our development and our design of technology. But now, as we're moving into the regulatory space, we're actually seeing a fragmentation again. We're seeing that as these regulations are coming up, there are different values behind them, there are different drivers, there are different lobbies, and I'm concerned, right, and this is why I'm inviting the civil society to really think about this, but how do we bridge the conversation now if we're moving down a regulatory space where we will see marked differences? So I'd like throughout this discussion to bring some of those discussions.
That's brilliant, Noel. Coming back to Avinashji. Avinashji, you work in the space of standards and benchmarking, right? How do you see the current circumstance in the context of what Vilas and Noel have mentioned?
Thank you, first of all, for this question. And from the perspective of benchmarking in AI, I think that we have to see maybe it's a slightly longer question.
Yeah, that's okay. Go ahead.
And maybe I may diverge from the question, but I want to just put the thinking behind this, that let us think that there are some fundamental questions, and then we will understand that where standards or standardization is required or not required. Like, what is ethical? That itself is a question. Like different countries or different regions or different use cases also, the definition of ethics may be different. Then who is going to define the ethics? Then what are the benchmarks that if we have defined some parameters, who is going to check or who is going to implement, how we are going to do that, whether we can certify? And then there is the question of inclusiveness and like there are big companies, there are startups, whether the AI applications are inclusive or they are biased. So all those things taken together, then we consider that perhaps we need certain benchmarks, certain standards, and they may have to be evolved for the particular use case or for the particular scenario that we are talking about or for the particular region.
I understand. So there are a couple of points that you've laid out. Alison, I'm going to take this with you. He's asking some fundamental points that to establish standards, a couple of important points that are important. One of them is what is ethical, the definition of it, and also trying to understand how diverse and inclusive that things can be, right? How do you see this from the perspective of looking at driving open source development or looking at that as a way to for the future of AI?
Well, I think there's one thing which is, enabling an ecosystem to grow. And we're at the very, very, AI is moving very quickly and we're at the beginning. And so I think having some standards and open source that everybody can use to innovate on so that we are not getting into potentially, you'll have competitive products, but such divergence in what is standardization. So one of the things about doing that is enabling some open source that's available in GitHub repos that people can go and then they can decide if they're going to keep it open or if they're going to fork and do something that's more proprietary. Ideally, we would be working together to get some level of standardization going. And on bias, I just wanted to talk about, you asked what are ethics, and
Yeah.
I think that's a complex question that I don't know if I'm the right person to say, but I think having integrity in everything that you do and doing something that's best for the most amount of people for the common good. That is what I think is really important and valuable. Unfortunately, with AI training, all that is coming from the society. So we're bringing our bias to whatever we're training. And that is a big issue because then you will have this unconscious bias. So one example would be if you want to make an AI avatar, if you're an Asian woman, it inherently makes it look like it's more sexy or something like this. And some of these things that are happening, or people of color not having that be able to really identify people, and then people are mistakenly put in jail because of facial recognition technologies, things like that are really not up to speed. So I think there's a lot around ethics tied into that. And I don't know if that was a good answer to your question, but it's my
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. So I wanted to take it to Oded. Now, in the context of what Alison is mentioning, specifically on the data being biased, right? And when you're developing systems and when you're looking at using effective AI systems, what you think is the core issue that you want to take into? Why is it critical?
Okay, so first of all, I have a comment about, I agree that in the coming, what we are doing now will affect the coming decades, but I would like to take it the other way around. The GDPR has a profound effect. You can say it has some negative effects, but you can't ignore it, and it affects the whole universe for many years. And I think that the regulatory storm that we are here now may have similar effect. I'm not talking about AI, I'm talking about the regulation of AI, the effect of the regulation. So for example, if you are going to throw away this magnificent tool just because you are afraid of some thing which are not really defined, then you're going to create current damage to save something that might never come. Answering your question about bias, there are many ways that you can define and fight bias, etc. And maybe I'll answer a slightly different question. Some people are offended when they are compared to something that they find inferior. Google has a very good example of misdetecting pictures of someone, and people got offended. I'm, as a mathematician, think that there is a concept 3, the number 3, and it doesn't really matter if it's 3 bananas or 3 tables. And sometimes I find it hard to understand why the table or the banana should be offended for being compared to another thing that shares the same abstract value 3. What we can do as AI is run this emotionless, cold-hearted decision, decide what we want to do and make it do it. So if we want to do not compare apples to chairs, then he will obliterate the numbers from the universe because they are abusing this comparison. And if we want to be unbiased, then in translation, breath reading, it should translate to he/she because it shouldn't be biased, etc. It can solve the problems, you just have to ask for it.
So essentially, it is a discriminative system. The purpose of it is discriminative. So we just need to be careful of where we want it to discriminate and where we should not be. This takes me to a question to you, Dr. Gopalakrishnan. The question to you is that at this point in time, ethics to practice, why is it critical from the standpoint of students?
Okay, my salutations to all. So first of all, just before answering the question, I will quickly add to the definition of ethics given by the moderator from a Tamil literature. So similarly, if you see the Sanskrit literature, the ethics could be translated to dharma. And dharma is known as something that upholds the society. So I think that is the final thing. So whatever that you are going to do, it should be for the benefit of humanity or for the benefit of society. Now, why we need it now? So the reason is that the question of ethics, what we need to be, I think, at least in my opinion, we need to be careful that we are not actually talking about ethics of AI, we are talking about ethics of human beings. And whether we are ethical or not, and now we have a very powerful tool. And what will happen if a powerful tool is there with somebody who is unethical? So that is the question that we are trying to answer. And from an educator's point of view, I think we need to instill values right from the beginning so that the future engineers or the future scientists who are going to develop these systems will be balanced individuals, not just they will think just based on the neutral, the ethically neutral scientific mode, but they will also have values, human values, they will also have traditional values which will compel them to make solutions which are beneficial for humanity.
Brilliant. And that brings the point to you, Vilas. You mentioned in your talks that values are going to be very, very important, right? Now, let's look at it from the perspective of the inflection point that we are in, that we need to take it to the next level of building tech for good, right? How should people building technology and educators teaching people building technology for the future should think about instilling values?
Yeah. Well, let me say two things. One, Dr. Balakrishnan, I so appreciated your point. I mean, I say often there is no such thing as ethical AI. Let's talk about that for a second, and we'll come to values.
Brilliant.
A technology system does not have values. It does not have ethical responsibilities. And we often conflate decision-making, which is a recommendation, which is a deterministic statistical process, with decision-making, which is a conscience-driven human attribute. We use the same word for both, but they're not the same thing. So when we come to this question, I think you're asking exactly the right one. We have proceeded down the path of technology development. I often think of it like we as a society have given a few people some amazing power tools, bulldozers and earth movers, and said, go and build some gleaming skyscrapers. And then we've said to some social change makers and philosophers and anthropologists, here's a plastic shovel and a plastic bucket, go to the beach and build a sandcastle. This is the world we live in. I think it's not okay that that's the world we live in. I think what all of our speakers are speaking to is the necessary convergence. That you should not be able to build a technology without asking the question, what consequence will this have? And how do we try to address that in our technological design, in the social implementation of the tool, and how we listen to how people are being hurt by it or saved by it? So the answer is, how do we do it? We do it in the same way that we've taught every other kind of morally responsible choice in our lives. We embed it with parents and children, we embed it with teachers and students, and maybe most of all, we force the outcome to say, as consumers, we will not use a product that cannot explain to us what its philosophical, ethical, humanist nature is.
Super. So I'm going to take it to you, Oded. Just start from the point of view that Vilas comes from. Say, it needs to be fundamentally embedded in the way somebody is thinking about an AI product itself, right? And it needs to be integrated with multiple stakeholder input, right? So that it is balanced and for social good. Now, as a mathematician and as somebody working in algorithms, how do you see this when you know that algorithms does not have their own values?
So first of all, I agree that guns don't kill, people using gun kills. So But on the other hand, the suggestion to require a license, like a medical license, to be permitted to write a single line of code is not the right way to go. So if, for example, people, even 2 years old people can draw pictures. They can put their hands on paper and draw pictures. We don't require license. They don't have a guild. They don't have to abide to ethical rules to be able to draw. But drawing can offend people. People got murdered because they drew something without the license, balanced, worldwide regulation coordination, because they just did it. And I think it's not that we should ask for a license to buy a pencil because you might use it to draw, but we should solve the problem, including the AI problem, by including high-level ethical rules. Thou shalt not create harm. If you're creating harm by painting something offensive without license, or by programming a program that has biases, or by talking to a conference and inciting people to do scary things, you should not do that, and it doesn't matter how.
This comes to the point, Noel, about defining harms. His perspective is that if we are able to define harms, we will be able to limit the potential of harms. From a policy perspective, in developing policy, how do you see definition of harms to be? And how critical is that in shaping the future of regulations as such?
So there are some issues in society that take such importance, right, because of the risk to harm, that it needs some kind of special protection, right? So we've seen examples of this, like the environment, right? You know, there's a lot of harm that was happening, you know, in terms of, you know, the emissions and all this, and it started off as an ethics issue, right? It was environmental ethics, but it's not enough. It's too important, right? Like the kinds of expectations that we want as a society to manage those harms need to be elevated. So quickly, we went from environmental ethics to environmental rights, where then there's a relationship of expectations and accountability, and there's a certain way for society to interact with those expectations with the mechanism. And I think with AI, we're now in that space. We're right at that nascence of moving from what we call AI ethics to like AI rights, when we can now start understanding as a society that the harm is so great, the risk is so great, that we need more stringent mechanisms you know, to address in proportion the importance of the issue.
So Alison, that has two shades to it, because what he's basically saying is that we should be able to think of not just about ethics, but also about rights, right? Now, rights and ethics are not common everywhere, right? While the principles may remain common, it is very contextual to certain elements, and it is also tied to cultural and lived experiences of people. How do you consider that? And how do you see that from the perspective of somebody building open source software?
Well, one thing I would say just about rights and ethics, I think one of the things that's interesting is that there's always these personal rights. One thing is personal rights, and it's always protecting like the user, for example. But what about the collective? And that is something that's interesting too, because so far we talk about our data and, you know, our information and is our privacy, et cetera, on a personal level. But I don't know that we're moving to the collective level. So that's one thing I just wanted to say about that. And this whole question of all this data that's being created by us training so much, who owns all that data? There's that as well. So that's something I just wanted to bring up that we could potentially discuss. And so it's the collective rights and the data, and then there's the personal rights, and then how do you get both government, private sector, because now private sector has the most influence on a lot of the governments, and the civil society organizations and NGOs to all come together to talk about both regulations and rights, personal rights as well as collective rights. So that's something that I just wanted to mention. And then I do think, you know, when you have something that's open source and you're giving it out to the world, you're trying to let everybody take this. It's free, right? So you're kind of handing off technology, and you're letting other people innovate on top of that technology, and then they can take it and use it. So I think from that perspective, it's really about the collective.
So, Avinash ji, just to extend that particular point, now when we are actually speaking about open source being a solution where somebody can build upon it, right? Standards cannot be built upon like that. You need to have a certain level of expectation in that. How do you see open source ethics and standards in this context?
So maybe my view is that open source is not a guarantee for an ethical product. Like it is there, open source is there, we can test it, we can do a lot of things with that, but even if there is a proprietary software or proprietary product, it could be passed through certain tests and then we can check whether it's meeting the benchmarks or not. So that is one point. Another is that like when we are building standards, so we have to also see the use case scenario, whether these standards are really required or not, who is going to use it, whether they are for some particular use case, are they mandatory or not. And just to give a twist to the discussion, like because I come from the telecom background, I would like to mention a particular use cases where AI is going to be used in future. Like, there are two scenarios. One is where the experts are using, we are just using AI to aid in decision making, like maybe expert system being used by some doctors, or someone mentioned ChatGPT in the previous session. But then there are other use cases where the AI systems are going to take decisions themselves. Like in telecom, every day we are discussing about 5G, now 6G. We are talking about Internet of Things, drone communication, other things. And even like just as you mentioned about open source. So just recently we had discussion that perhaps in future we could have open source hardware, like instead of having a proprietary handset, we could have a generic open source hardware on which AI applications would be residing, and they would, like, it's open source hardware, so applications can be built by small developers, and then you have a stack, and based on that the 6G is built up. So now we need benchmarks, standards, so that even the startups or the small companies, they are able to compete and face the challenges coming from bigger companies or multinationals. So perhaps
I understand. This also takes me to another question to you, Vilas. Now, when we are actually speaking about whether technology for good or open source technology, one of the fundamentals is that if we speak about pre-trained models, they are trained on certain data set, right? There are some concerns about the source of the data set itself. And there are both personal data and non-personal data, right? So while a lot of attention of privacy is on personal data, given the way the exposure of personal world is, even having access to non-personal data can make a huge difference, right? And it can have both positive humanity advantage and negative disastrous circumstances, right? So how do you see that from a tech for good perspective, and what are two advices that you want to give for people looking at this point in time?
Yeah. It's a timely question. In just the last few weeks, 2 papers have been released. One indicates that just having access to the accelerometer data on your phone, the device that measures how your phone moves and changes over time. You can find gender, you can find age, you can find a number of physiological and morphological characteristics. There's no such thing as non-personal data anymore, right? Every piece of data tracks to something about you. So what does that mean? I want to come back to this open source concept that Alison and Avinash have spoken to. There's, I think, a commonly shared sense that open source means uncontrolled, ungoverned. It's an anarchist kind of mode. You generate, you put, you build together. But that's not the ideal. You think about something like a transformer model, a large language model. It can be trained on data that should be ethically sourced, that should be transparent, that should be identified. But then between the point that it's trained and the point that it's released, you have to have a process of going in and cutting out those pathways that could lead to particularly toxic outcomes. So who does that? I think it leads us to the most critical question, which is whether open source or not, what are the institutions of human governance that are going to be capable of, at a technological level and an ethical level, doing this in a way that represents our best interests?
This is a very valid point, and I want to look at it from a legal side of things, where somebody is building a regulation on this, right? Noel, how do you see that?
Thank you for that. So one thing that's really interesting, because I love open source, and I do think there's a lot of value there, but I'd also like to suggest open source policymaking. So this was an experiment that Canada did when I was working on the AI policies for Canada. And the idea is applying those principles of open source in your policy, in your lawmaking, and really encourage your governments to draft in the open, right? And for the same way that the benefits of code and transparency and understanding where things are going, being able to repurpose, open by default policy making, I think is the future. And I think as civil society, as these regulations are coming up, definitely putting the pressure that these kinds of initiatives should be open by default is a sound and wise approach.
Oded, that takes me to a question to you on this. Vilas mentioned that there is nothing called non-personal data, because there's going to be a touch point somewhere or other, if not directly, indirectly, right? So in that particular case, so when somebody is dealing with non-personal data while building the AI system, right? But subsequently used to identify for different purposes. That's the bigger challenge that we face at this point in time. In many of the AI systems that we use in day-to-day life also, they are very, very useful from our personal benefit perspective, but we see that the use is getting exploited at some point in time, right? So as a mathematician and somebody who develops AI system, how do you see this phenomena? Do you think the rules that you mentioned in terms of ethical set of rules are good enough to sustain this? Because the people who built it may not be the people who are maintaining it at this point in time. So how do you see that?
So, like in everything in life, there are dilemmas, and you should balance things. As Ellison said, there is not only the personal privacy, but also the collective needs. For example, 100 years ago, people were, especially babies, were dying from cancer in alarming rates, and they started investigating, and after too many years of investigation, they found out that X-ray radiation is dangerous, especially for pregnant women. And they didn't know it. They used to measure your shoes in store by having a video X-ray of your shoe instead of feeling it. You have a booth at the street. You can take a photo of yourself, of your bones or whatever, because they didn't realize it's dangerous. The only way to find that it's dangerous is by breaking the privacy, by making a lot of research on private, personal medical data to find the correlation between having an X-ray and your baby has cancer. And you can't do it if you are taking the privacy to the extreme, because if you take it, nobody would ever be able to do any medical research. So in order to balance the collective needs, we must, on purpose, invade privacy. We shouldn't do it more than needed. We should be careful, but we must do it.
Can I respond quickly?
Yes.
And no need to turn it into a debate. I agree with you in principle. But let's be honest, there are ways to do that in a right way and ways to do it in a wrong way, right? And we've often thought about consent as the ways in which you change it from invading privacy to be able to do it at scale. There are significant ethical challenges presented, though, when you begin to think about, particularly in the medical space, invading privacy in order to promote collective outcomes. And I think in the data and AI world, it's quite tricky, because it's easy to look at a data set, to say this is depersonalized, and to move quickly to the application without actually spending the time to consider it, and there's no forcing function. So it goes back to the question, yes, you're right that it's possible. Who determines if it's right? And where do we have the conversation to set those principles? Thanks, sorry, thanks for letting me.
That's absolutely right. And that's where I wanted to take it to Dr. Gopalakrishnan to ask him this question. As students, they're going to be relying on what's available open source, what's accessible for them, whether it is personal data or non-personal data. People may choose to even scrape data from tools, right, for the purpose of building their models. Now, these are significant ethical issues. These traits that they're going to be learning now are going to be impacting in the future. And that's the same thing that many companies may be doing it for their commercial products. How do you see this? And what do you want to do as one thing that will impact those students to ensure that they are not they're not killing themselves with their own knife?
Okay. Before I just answer that question, just I will point out one thing, like many of our experts were telling that, like once you bring regulation, then it is a detriment to innovation. So you can't have regulation and innovation hand in hand. That is very difficult. However, coming back to your question, I feel that's why I was mentioning in the beginning itself, like first we need to make people aware of the dangers or the implications of using AI, data leakage, data privacy, etc. So not to name any large language model, now we know that all over the world people are using large language models like in all possible ways, and they don't know what all data that they have already exchanged and what is the implication of that. So similarly, what you said, like when somebody is giving an assignment, let it be a assignment based on an educational assignment, or it could be a startup. So then we are not actually, if you do not appraise your employees or your students about the implications of ethics, then it's going to be really, really dangerous. So you are going to create something that could, as you said, it could come back. And as Dr. Bhavani Rao was telling, it could be the mythological Bhasmasura. So we should be really careful.
That's absolutely true. There was one thing that Dr. Bhavani Rao was mentioning. I made a note of it. It is complex problems require complex solutions. You cannot have simple solution for it. Don't try and find a simple solution to say this will solve all the problem. And this is what happened when we speak about bias mitigation. Right? A lot of people came up with measures to say, we will mitigate bias, and these are the metrics that you can use, and it will work. It didn't work, and it won't work because it is so contextual, and we're going to go through the evolutionary process. Now that we are at this stage, right, we've set the context on several topics on ethics. I wanted to just straight ask you this question, right? What are the roadblocks in making ethics work? Let me start with Vilas.
Yeah. The first one is economic self-interest. Ethics are great and useful to talk about, but when you want to deploy products and you want to capture market share and you want to build to get that very addictive sense of engagement that social media has represented, when you want eyeballs on the screen so you can sell advertising, ethics takes a backseat. That's one. And the second is the distributed nature of collective obligation. Ethics is something that we all need to have a voice in, but our structures, our institutions, our processes aren't set up in a way to let every single one of us have a direct voice. So those are the two I'll identify now.
That's brilliant. Aminachi, what would you say?
Thank you. So instead of saying roadblocks, I would say what could be the enablers in the reverse direction. That one could be there need to be some policy initiatives, like as you mentioned about data. We have already, like in government, we have drafted up guidelines for anonymization of data, which would, once approved, will facilitate release of data, because we have a policy, and then you can release data which is used data available with government organizations. Another is like we can facilitate in creating awareness. Now, like we have already constituted a working group, and you are part of that group, and we are framing standards. So for framing benchmarks, we need a collaborative approach where government, researchers, industry, all they come together. We have to work with the international organizations, because we cannot survive or work in isolation. So we, from Government of India, we are trying to work with the international standardization organizations like ITU, IEEE. We have already initiated some work. IEC we are approaching. So I will not take much time. I will just list 3 enablers, but there can be many more. There are some views, but then maybe I will share later. Thank you.
Great. Oded, what is your view? 2 roadblocks or enablers, as the case may be.
A friend of mine, a machine learning researcher, Shai Shelev, once said, people are not interested in explainable AI, explicable. If it works, and you don't need any explanation. And if it doesn't work, explanation won't help me. So what you need to do is make sure it works. And the same goes for all the privacy. If people are not, most people are not concerned with their private data being known to others. They are concerned about the implication of usage of this data. If somebody knows everything about me but does nothing about it, I can even not know about it, but of course I won't be offended from it. And I think what we do in the regulation is what we had in the vaccine story. People are making all kinds of hype that you should keep all the data private. People are not keeping their data private enough, etc. And as a result, this is an obstacle. I am answering your question. What is the roadblock? The roadblock would be that people would object to anything that is using data because we poison their mind by the regulation or even suggesting a regulation. That's it.
How do you see this, Noel?
So I see the two roadblocks that I see is, the first is we don't actually know what we're talking about. And I think that is the hardest problem, right? I mean, we're still trying to define in regulation what is AI. We're still trying to capture the right scope. So
yeah, the definition of AI is still not set. We're still rolling around.
We don't know what we're talking about. So I think that's probably the most fatal one. And the second one, I think it's the flip side to what Vilas was saying in terms of like economic self-interest. But I think there's a culture problem, right? And the culture could be organizational, it could be us, but bringing in even those guardrails, even those policy mechanisms is an extremely uphill battle, because we are battling culture, both our own fears, our own resistances, and also the cultural bureaucracies and obstacles within our organizations.
Yeah. Just one moment, I just wanted to make a point to what Noel mentioned before I get to you, Alison. I always see this as ethics versus economics equation, right? So if I want to elaborate it, it's an equation of ethics and human rights on one side, economics and power on the other side, right? In whichever format. What we're trying to do is how can we equip and support ethics and human rights to play, to some extent, equitable role against economics and power, right? And it's a common philosophical understanding that we know that at the end of the day, the way the world revolves, we're going to end up having economics or power win to a certain extent, but how far we are able to balance that is the way. And that's where I think your point comes into play. To you, Alison, what are the two roadblocks that you think in this context?
I don't know, but what I just was thinking about when you were saying that was just about specific countries and their philosophy. So for example, in China, it's very common for them to have surveillance cameras everywhere. They have video cameras everywhere. They have that data. They have facial recognition. They can, see who's going where. They are a very controlled society. During COVID, boom, lockdown, right? And then, of course, there's the ability for, or lack thereof, of freedom of speech and different social platforms, right, for people to protest those kinds of things. And then you have other societies that are very, very open, and people don't want surveillance. They don't want certain types of things. So I think about the role of kind of the society based on the form of government that is in a certain place or not. That's one. And then, I don't even know if I'm answering your question specifically, but there are like policies, specs, standards bodies, there's government, there's industry, private, academia, venture capitalists. How do you get people, to Noel's point, like we don't know what we're talking about, to come together in some type of a think tank way, bringing all representatives from the different societies so that you can get to some level of agreement on a problem statement. Then you can move to potential, kind of what can you do about that problem statement as a whole, and try to have maybe some guardrails with a lot of open area to create and co-create some types of solution. So that's I don't know.
That's a great point, and I was making note of when Oded was mentioning, and also Noel was mentioning. It's also a point that Avinash mentioned. It's about working in isolation, It's
Right.
like we are trying to bring people together, whether it is standards organization, whether it is regulatory bodies, whether it is civil society. It's a need to connect. And at this point in time, these are neither connected within their group, nor connected outside the group, right? So events like this are essentially an opportunity to bring that together and then see how we can progress that. Thank you. Thanks
I think
for
it's like
mentioning.
radical collaboration, and I like the idea of, you know, kind of having things be transparent and open too, so that we can create that type of openness. But that is also dependent on where you are, you know.
Absolutely, absolutely. Dr. Gopalakrishnan, what do you feel?
Yeah, so I wish
roadblocks.
to answer this maybe from a more fundamental way, I would say, or more philosophical way. So pardon me if I am going too philosophical.
Yeah, ethics
So-
has a philosophical ground,
Yeah.
so it doesn't matter. Huh?
Yeah, so I feel like we are asking, so it's like asking an AI engine or an AI platform that I have built, will it perform something? So similar, so it is going to depend upon the purpose for which it is created. So now you translate that question to this, like, can we be ethical? So what are the roadblocks of we being ethical? So this is not just limited to AI, but if we ask, the fundamental limitation that we have is we are products of Darwinian evolution. And whether we are here for being ethical, our evolutionary structure never supports it. So we need to make a conscious effort. And what I think is that science is not the only solution for making us ethical. We need to have spirituality, or we need to have values, and that needs to be blended with science, and that can only make us ethical. That's what I feel.
So you just transformed the question into an answer. So that's so brilliant. So it helps me transition into the next point so easily. So now we've spoken about several of the roadblocks, so to say, whether it is economic self-interest, distributed nature of obligations, working in isolation, the hype cycle, the knowledge clarity level, including to the extent of even defining AI, and the cultural context, right? None of these are things that can be solved with one single bullet, right? What is one important thing that you think will be very, very helpful in this whole process? I know you started with spirituality, so I'm just hoping that that's a good answer to start with. If you have an additional answer, please share. If not, we can actually take it from.
Yeah, I
Alison.
would say that the spirituality, which is now we need to translate that into maybe values, because maybe defining a moral landscape that is acceptable for everyone. So that is the first training that we need to give to all young people. So once you train them on that, then they are not going to do anything unethical.
Yeah. So in ethical philosophy level, this is essentially called as a shared moral framework. How are you able to create a shared moral framework so that you are able to translate the principles into practice, right? And thanks for bringing that up. Alison, how you see that? What is one solution that you think will be very, very helpful in the context of that what we are speaking? It may not be a silver bullet.
I think we need to have some basic education so that there's some fundamental agreement about what we're talking about. So just, you know, really getting people to have some understanding collectively of what some of the issues are, and then what are potential opportunities to solve these issues.
Brilliant. Noel.
Open source rulemaking.
Super. That's a good suggestion. Let's start sharp. Oded.
I have two solutions. One is we talked about the problem of comparing apples to oranges. On one side we have privacy and ethics, and on the other side we have the economics and the money. And the way to solve it is to move them both to the same side of the equation. So either talk about ethics versus ethics, the ethics of privacy versus the ethics of the right to get information, collective information that must be collected. So that's an ethical, pure ethical conversation, or move it to the pure economical side, meaning there are research about ESG. Green companies have better stock value. So if you want, now it's a problem of whether you want the next quarter earning better, that's a short term, or you want your ESG better. And again, it's money versus money, or ethics versus ethics. That's would be easy.
And thanks a lot for bringing that up. That brings me different ideas that I can explore with myself. That's a good idea to say that compare ethics with ethics. Don't compare ethics with economics, right? that's a progression that we need to make. I don't think it's an easier progression for the world per se, but that's definitely a direction that we need to look at. Avinashji, how do you see that?
And I promise too, the second one is
Yes.
To answer Noel's question about how to define AI, don't define it. If the ethical is an ethical, generic ethical principle, it should apply to everything, including AI, which is undefined.
Oh, okay. So you're saying that define ethics, don't define AI. We'll figure it out. Okay. Avinashji.
Okay, so to answer your question, like the one solution that we thought was that to have a voluntary fairness certification kind of thing. So it covers a lot of things, like about the things she said of creating awareness. Even the developers are not aware of the concept of fairness, which is a small part of the ethical debate in AI. When we talk of voluntary, it's voluntary, so it's not regulated, it's not mandatory, so there is no government or other control. And when we talk of certification, that means that we already have in place certain agreed benchmarks, and once the certification is there, it brings equity, it brings opportunity for especially the startups, developers, students, like those who might be doing great work.
So
here.
basically standards are the solution.
Standards plus voluntary certification, because if you have standards, there are lots of standards, but no one is using them, then they are of no use.
So that ties into that point Alison mentioned. It's about awareness and commitment.
And
to
involvement of the stakeholders while developing the standards.
Perfect. Great. Vilas, what's your thought?
Great. I love all of this. I'm going to turn your question into an invitation and a challenge to the people that are in this room. I think one of the big problems is these conversations are happening on stages and people are listening. It's not the point. Make lemonade out of lemons. Go on social media. Begin to start a conversation about ethics and AI that you own. Let's turn it into something that's broad-based, that's distributed, that's grassroots, that's students and professors and thinkers who are actually willing to talk about this stuff in public, right? Engage with us on social media. Follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter. Take courses on ethics and generative AI. Use this as a pathway to make this your conversation. And that, I think, is the silver bullet.
That's definitely a silver bullet, because it's not about somebody else determining what is ethical for all of you here. It's about you determining what is ethical for all of you. Brilliant. Now we come to the last session. Now I'm going to have a surprise rapid fire for all of you, and it'll be quick. See, very simple. This is a panel. Panel should have three things in my view: entertainment, education, and enlightenment. Let's go through that. We're more or less covered there. Okay. Let's start with Vilas. Vilas, to you. Responsible open source or regulated open source?
Responsible open source.
Great. Economic value, compassionate value.
Compassion.
Education, framework, standards.
Education.
Brilliant. Let's go to Noel. So interpretations are open to you guys. There is no interpretation or explanation in this. Okay. Enterprise regulation or project level regulation?
Enterprise.
Techno risk approach, governance approach.
Governance approach.
Great. Open policy making.
Open policy making.
Okay, great. Let's go toward it. Embed ethics in computation, enable human oversight. What is your choice?
Can you repeat?
Embed ethics in computation or enable human oversight? What will you give priority to? We are speaking in the context of ethics.
The first one.
First one. Okay, good. Ensure open issues are addressed or limitations are disclosed. What is your choice?
Limitation?
Limitations of AI tools are disclosed or open issues are addressed before release.
limitations are disclosed.
Limitations are disclosed. Great. Thank you for your answers. Now let's go to Dr. Gopalakrishnan. Education or skill building or value building on ethics?
Value building on ethics.
Okay. One ethical framework or toolkit to build many?
Toolkit to build many.
Brilliant. Independent ethical research or embed ethics in every research?
Embed ethics in every research.
Thank you. Now, who did I miss? I missed Avinashji. Okay, Avinashji, to you. Regulations, standards, sandboxes, rank in the order of priority for you.
So mix all three of them together.
No. Rank. Regulations, standards, sandboxes.
So for standards come first, then we can test them sandboxes, and regulations flow from the sandbox outputs.
Great. Okay. Just tell me which of these works from your perspective, right? India's ethical principles will help transform AI ethics. India's ethical principles will complement global AI ethics. India's ethical principles will help in multi-stakeholder feedback. Which one do you think relates to you most?
Second and third both. Complement also, and we'll get multiple stakeholder inputs both.
Okay. Now I have a last question for you.
The answer is yes.
Okay. No, it's not a yes or no question, by the way. What is more important, diversity or inclusion?
Please. They're both essential.
Okay, great.
That's why I'm on the panel. So it wouldn't be a manel, honestly.
That's one of the essential points that I want to leave with, because it's not a choice between A or B, it's a choice in a specific context. You cannot make a choice without a context. So at the end of the day, while we have discussed several topics, I want all of you to recognize that ethics is not a topic that we can determine clear answers on. There are many answers for the same question. We need to evolve to see what answers we seek in the context of the problem that we are dealing with. I'm so happy to have had all these panelists and those fantastic responses and engagement. I'm open to any questions that you may have for the panelists, so that we... Oh, there's no time for questions, so please feel free to ask questions to any of the panelists after they are done with the panel, after they're out of the stage. Thanks a lot for your time. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Sundar, and the esteemed panelists. That was an awesome session, wasn't it? They deserve another round of applause for sure. Thank you. We would like to acknowledge the participation and the contributions of some of the panelists here. So we would like to honor them with a very small token of our appreciation. And I would like to request Mr. Vilas Dar to give a small memento of our appreciation to Dr. Oded Margalit. Thank you. Now I would like to request Alison Richards to give a memento to Mr. Noel Corvu. Now I'd like to request Dr. Gopalakrishnan to give a memento to Mr. Avinash Agarwal. And lastly, for rocking the house with such fantastic moderation, I'd like to request Amar to give a memento of appreciation to Sundar Narayan. Thank you, everybody. we will have the next session as a special address by Mr. Paul Nemitz. So